The year was 1941, and the Pacific shimmered deceptively under golden light. Thousands of miles from Washington and Tokyo, a confrontation was brewing that would engulf island chains, naval fleets, and millions of soldiers in fire. Among them was Lieutenant Daniel Hart, a fresh-faced pilot from Nebraska, barely 22, with dust from farm fields still lingering in his memory. He had joined the U.S. Navy just 2 years prior, fueled by a boyish sense of duty and the thrill of flight. He never expected the war to chase him across the vast Pacific, much less to become a part of the war's deadliest chapters. Half a world away, Captain Kenji Nakamura stared across the water from his post aboard the carrier Akagi. Born in Osaka, trained in the Imperial Japanese Navy since boyhood, he believed in Japan's divine mission to carve an empire of its own. His loyalty was not blind. It was cultural, bred through discipline and centuries of imperial tradition. Where Daniel hoped for peace, Kenji prepared for war. The two men did not know it yet, but their destinies were set on a collision course as unyielding as the steel of the ships they served aboard. The routes of the Pacific were stretched back years before these men took their positions. Japan's expansion into China had already drawn international outrage, but the West's economic sanctions, particularly the American oil embargo, fell to Tokyo like a noose. The Japanese leadership saw one option: strike before being strangled. A secret plan was born in silence and executed with surgical precision, an aerial assault that would cripple the American Pacific Fleet before it could react. On December 7, 1941, Daniel was stationed at Pearl Harbor. The morning began like any other, sunlight dancing on the harbor waters. He had just finished breakfast and was heading toward the hangar when the first wave screamed overhead. At first, he thought it was a drill. That illusion shattered as bombs erupted across Battleship Row. The sky turned black with smoke and red with flame as the USS Arizona exploded in a fireball that seemed to tear the heavens open. Daniel dug behind a truck, bullets chipping the concrete beside him. The world had changed in an instant, and he would never be the same. Back aboard the Akagi, Kenji sat with his flight crew in tense silence. Their mission had been a success, devastating and complete. Yet in his gut, there was a gnawing unrest. They had struck a slumbering giant, and the retribution would be unimaginable. Still, duty overrode doubt. The Japanese had stunned the world, and in doing so, set into motion the machinery of global retaliation. In the days that followed, Daniel volunteered for every mission he could. He trained harder, flew faster, and watched his friends fall one by one in early skirmishes across the Pacific. The Japanese advances were relentless. The Philippines, Hong Kong, Malaya all fell like dominoes. It was as if the empire's might was unstoppable. Yet Daniel, like many others, refused to believe that all was lost. One battle haunted him. In the skies of a coral sea, he faced off against skilled Japanese pilots for the first time. One fighter in particular, painted with a red dragon on its fuselage, danced through the clouds with deadly elegance. Daniel swore he saw the pilot's face through the glass canopy, a face full of quiet resolve, almost brotherly in its focus. It was Kenji, though neither knew the other's name. Their duel would spark something deeper than enmity. It was mutual respect born in fire and fear. The Coral Sea was technically a draw, but for the Americans, it was a turning point. It showed that the Japanese Navy could be stopped, that courage could contest strategy. And more importantly, it preserved Australia from invasion. The tide was beginning to shift, even if only slightly. Kenji returned to Japan a decorated officer, but his pride was muted. The cost of men and metal had been high, and for the first time, he began to question the war's endgame. Japan was winning battles, but each victory bled them. The empire was overextended and American industry was a monster beginning to awaken. Daniel, meanwhile, received orders that would change his life. Deployment to Midway Atoll. Intelligence had hinted at a major Japanese offensive. The Americans were readying a trap, hoping to turn the tables. Daniel knew the risk. He also knew that nothing short of total commitment would suffice. He kissed a photo of his family, zipped his flight suit, and climbed aboard his plane. As the sun set on that fateful evening in May 1942, both men stood at the edge of the most consequential battle of the Pacific. Midway would test not just their skills, but their faith in their nations, their leaders, and themselves. Neither could imagine how drastically their lives would be altered by what came next. The morning of June 4th, 1942, broke with a deceptive calm over Midway Atoll. Daniel Hart sat in his dauntless dive bomber, sweat already forming beneath his goggles. He reviewed the mission briefing one final time in his head. Strike the Japanese fleet before they could launch a full assault on the island. The air buzzed with tension, and every man around him knew the stakes. This wasn't a routine skirmish. It was a gamble for control of the Pacific. The enemy's fleet, though wounded at Coral Sea, remained a terrifying force, and it was approaching fast. Across the ocean, Kenji Nakamura, ready to zero fighter aboard the aircraft carrier Akagi. The confidence of Pearl Harbor had faded, replaced by an ominous weight. His commanders believed the Americans were still reeling, but Kenji felt otherwise. The enemy had been learning, adapting. The loss of their aircraft carrier Lexington at Coral Sea had hurt, but not broken them. And now they were here, guarding a tiny atoll that had somehow become a decisive target. Still, orders were orders. His job was to escort bombers and destroy what remained of Midway's defenses. Daniel's squadron launched early, cutting to the clouds and ocean mist. The intelligence had been right. The Japanese fleet was there, massive and terrifying, dark gray hulls gliding through the water like predators. Anti-aircraft fire burst upward almost immediately, black puffs against the morning sky. Daniel pushed his plane into a dive, the G-forces slamming him into a seat as he zeroed in on the Kaga. All around him, his squadron was doing the same, risking everything for a shot at crippling the enemy. At nearly the same moment, Kenji spotted the first wave of American planes descending like vultures. The sky became chaos. He peeled off to intercept, bullets stitching the air as he gave chase. One by one, dive bombers fell, engulfed in flame or spiraling into the sea. But others got through. He looked down in time to see a bomb strike the deck of the Kaga, the explosion swallowing sailors in a bloom of fire. Another hit the Akagi itself. The shock wave rattled his plane, and he gritted his teeth, knowing the tide had turned. Daniel pulled up just in time, a geyser of water rising behind him as flak chased his tail. He dared glance back and saw the Akagi burning, smoke coiling into the sky like a signal to the world. They had done it. The Japanese carriers were ablaze. He felt a surge of triumph, but it was brief. His tail gunner, Anderson, was shouting. Zeros were closing in. Daniel turned sharply, the dive bomber groaning under pressure, trying to outmaneuver the attackers. He couldn't see the pilot behind him, but somewhere in that fray, Kenji was flying to his own squadron, decimated, his home ship aflame, yet still fighting. The next few days unfolded in a blur of exhaustion and disbelief. For Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu had been sunk. It was a staggering loss for Japan, one from which its naval air power would never truly recover. Daniel landed his damaged plane on Midway, greeted by cheers, but his eyes were haunted. He had seen too much. Friends lost, planes tumbling like falling stars, young men dying far from home. It was a victory, yes, but it was also a warning. The cost of this war was going to be unimaginable. Kenji survived barely. After bailing from his crippled Zero, he floated in the Pacific for hours until a destroyer picked him up. When he finally set foot on a Japanese ship again, he felt no sense of pride. He felt grief. The Akagi had been his home, his brotherhood. It now lay at the bottom of the ocean. His commanders still spoke of the Empire's glory, but Kenji could feel it. Their invincibility had shattered. Midway wasn't just a battle lost. It was a myth undone. Meanwhile, Daniel was redeployed, this time to the Solomon Islands. He spent nights writing letters home. He wasn't sure would arrive. He thought often of the enemy pilots he had seen, wondering who they were beneath the helmets and flight suits. He didn't hate them. He couldn't. They were young men just like him, drawn into a storm no one could control. The difference was only the flag stitched to their sleeves. As Guadalcanal loomed on the horizon, both Daniel and Kenji prepared for the next chapter, shaped by what they had seen and survived at Midway. One carried the burden of loss, the other the weight of victory that felt far too heavy. And both now understood the same truth. The war in the Pacific would not end quickly nor cleanly. It would grind forward through jungle, sea, and sky until one side collapsed from exhaustion. The sun blazed mercilessly over coral beaches of Guadalcanal as Daniel Hart crouched in the shadow of a palm tree, sweat trickling down his temple despite the breeze. Months had passed since Midway, but the war had only grown more brutal, more intimate. There were no grand fleets here, no sky-splitting carrier battles, just dense jungles, mosquito-filled nights, and the constant hum of death nearby. Daniel's squadron now supported ground troops locked in a grinding fight for the island's vital airfield. Victory at Midway had not ended anything. It had only opened the door to a longer, bloodier road. Nearby, the Marines called it Hell's Island, and they weren't exaggerating. Skirmishes flared nightly, ambushes exploded from the tree-line, and no one ever felt truly safe. Daniel flew missions every day, strafing enemy positions and protecting supply ships from above. He no longer needed a briefing to understand the stakes. Every mission was survival. His tail gunner, Anderson, who had once joked nonstop even during dives, now stared silently at the jungle below, his hand always resting on the sidearm he now carried even outside the cockpit. On the other side of the island, Kenji Nakamura was no longer flying a Zero after Midway. His squadron had been reassigned to Rabaul, and now he served as an observer and forward air controller embedded with Japanese infantry on Guadalcanal. He had once soared through the skies with freedom. Now he waded through the underbrush, marking targets and calling in artillery on advancing American forces. He felt the war closing in, tightening like a vice around both sides. Food was scarce. Illness spread like fire. His men were emaciated, their faces hollowed by hunger and hopelessness, but still they fought with fanatical determination. There was no retreat. There never had been. Daniel noticed at first in the patterns of enemy movement. Attacks were becoming desperate, less coordinated, more suicidal. His squadron had intercepted a wave of enemy bombers flying dangerously low, clearly stripped down for a last-ditch strike. His commander warned of a coming offensive, a storm designed to overwhelm the American positions and destroy Henderson Field once and for all. Everyone prepared. No one slept. That night, under the pale light of a clouded moon, the jungle erupted. Japanese soldiers surged from the trees with bayonets fixed and screams echoing through the darkness. Daniel, grounded that night due to engine issues, joined the perimeter defense alongside Marines. Bullets cracked through the air. Flares cast flickering shadows on the chaos. He fired blindly, sweat mixing with gun oil as enemy soldiers burst through the foliage, some already wounded, all seemingly beyond fear. Kenji was there, crouched in the mud, radio in hand, guiding artillery toward the American lines. He could barely hear himself over the roar of battle, the screams of the wounded, the whine of incoming shells. One explosion lifted him off his feet and sent him sprawling. Dazed, he crawled to the side of a wounded comrade who clutched a photograph in bloodied fingers. It was a family portrait. Kenji hesitated. He wanted to say something, but nothing came, just silence. The same silence he remembered from the Akaji's final moments. By dawn, the assault had failed. The American lines held, barely. The Japanese left hundreds of bodies in the jungle, many of whom had died not from wounds, but starvation and exhaustion. Daniel walked the battlefield, now eerily quiet, with a sick feeling churning in his gut. He passed a soldier slumped against a tree, eyes open, rifle in his lap. There was no glory here, no triumph, just loss on both sides. Kenji survived the offensive, but was pulled from the front line days later. His commander cited his injuries, but he suspected they were merely conserving experienced men for future battles. He boarded a transport ship back to Rabaul, numb and silent, replaying the screams of the dying in his mind. The war was no longer about honor or duty. It was about endurance. And even that seemed to be running out. Months later, Daniel rotated out, sent back to the States for recovery and rest. He was hailed as a hero, given medals and a brief parade. But in every handshake, every grateful smile, he saw the faces of fallen, Anderson, who didn't make it past the final air raid, the Marines who had joked with him on quiet nights only to vanish in smoke and fire. The war had changed him. It had stripped away illusions and left behind something quieter, harder, unshakable. Kenji, too, returned to a homeland far different from the one he had left. Rations were short. Morale was lower. He passed people on the streets who no longer bowed proudly at the sight of a uniform. They averted their eyes. They understood now that the war they had once cheered was devouring everything. Neither man ever met the other. They fought in the same skies, walked the same ruined beaches, yet remained forever on opposite sides. But if they had, perhaps they would have seen something familiar in each other, something beyond enemy lines, a shared understanding of sacrifice, of sorrow, of what it truly means to fight in a war that never ends where it began.